What I love about living in Sydney. What are the pros and what are the cons? My name is Amanda and I've been living in Sydney for my whole life, which is 24 years, almost 25. I'm turning 25 on the 1st of November. I have done my fair share of traveling, as you can see from my previous video where I ranked the 27 countries that I have visited. I will link that video down below for you guys to check out. But for the majority of my life, I have lived in Sydney. I've gone on mini road trips to other towns in Australia and New South Wales in particular, but my whole life has been in Sydney. I was born here. My parents immigrated here when they were in their late teens / early 20s. They met here in Australia at TAFE, New South Wales. Actually, if you live in Sydney or New South Wales, you'd know what that is. It's basically just a type of college that isn't a university. And my mum's Vietnamese, so she came from Saigon in Vietnam, or Ho Chi Minh City, and my dad is Chinese and he came from Guangzhou in China. Because I have lived in Sydney for basically my whole life, I obviously don't have a huge reference point on what it's like to live somewhere else. Like, for example, I didn't grow up somewhere else and then move to Sydney or something like that, so my opinions are probably going to be a bit biased, as it naturally would be, but I wanted to share my experience as an Asian Australian, born, raised, growing up in Sydney, and what my opinions are of the pros and cons. So I'm going to start off with the pros first, and then after the pros I'll go into the cons. The first thing that I love about living in Sydney is the nature, particularly the beaches, because I am an island girl at heart. I love the beach, I love the water, I love the sea, I love going snorkeling and going to see all the fish. It's just a serene experience and I love being in water. I feel like it's such a meditative experience and you just feel like all of your stresses melt away when you're just one with nature. There's a simplicity of the water, the sand, the sun and the breeze on your skin. Sydney does have, I believe, one of the best beaches in the world. We have wavy beaches, we have calm bays, we have sand beaches, which is my favorite thing because I've been to Europe and I've been overseas with rock and pebble beaches, and I gotta tell you, I don't like those because they really hurt your feet when you go swimming in them and you have to wear water shoes, whereas in Sydney I can just be barefooted and not have to worry about things poking my feet as I swim. There are also some rock beaches here as well, so if you do like that, if you don't like sand, then there is that option. I think Australia in general has the best beaches, and I love that Sydney City is so close to the beach. Out of all the metropolitan cities like Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth and Sydney, Perth and Adelaide are close to the beach, like the CBD is really close to the beach. Sydney in particular is like 15 to 20 minute drive to the beach because our settlement started there when the convicts came. But all of the other cities that are quite major, like Melbourne and Brisbane, which are the more major cities other than Sydney, they actually aren't near the beach. So in Melbourne I think it's like a 1.5 or 2 hour drive to get to the closest beach. Brisbane has like a man-made beach, which is great for them I guess, but nothing beats a natural beach. You'd have to go drive to the Gold Coast or the Sunshine Coast to go to nice beaches up there. So Sydney has the best beaches. In saying that, Sydney also has really great walks and hikes if that is your thing. We've got the Blue Mountains, which is close by. You can go, you know, see all of the nature and the hikes there. There's also nice hikes near the beaches. Sydney is just an amazing city to be in nature in. The next pro I would say about Sydney is the food scene. So there is a plethora of different restaurants, cafes, and There's so many different ethnicities and cultures in all the different parts of Sydney, depending on which suburb you go to. Each suburb in Sydney kind of has its own ethnic, I guess, specialty, you could call it. There's so many different cuisines. There's Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Middle Eastern food. There is just no shortage of different varieties and different types of food, and I think our produce and our meat are super fresh, and so you can always kind of count on Sydney restaurants to be just really nice and very yummy. If you are like looking for different types of food, Sydney is definitely a place where you can try different things because we are such a multicultural city. And that would go into my next point that I love about Sydney, is that Sydney is so diverse and multicultural. We have so many different ethnicities that live here. It's just really nice to connect with people of all different language, cultures and skin colors. The other thing that I love about Sydney is the weather, and I love the warm weather. One, because I can go to the beach, but two, because it just helps to elevate my mood. I know that I am a person that does get a bit of seasonal depression when winter hits and it's super rainy and gloomy. When I was considering moving to the UK to work overseas, I was like, oh, actually I think I would be quite depressed during the winter months because it's so cold there and I hate the cold. I think my Southeast Asian background just loves the heat. We have amazing weather in Sydney. We have all the 4 seasons, except they're not super extreme, if that makes sense. Well, in summer it can get quite hot, like it can get up to 40 degrees in summer, but in winter it is cold and you'll definitely need to wear a jacket and things like that, but it's not that cold winter. It is just nice to not have to wake up in the morning and have to like dig snow out of your driveway, because I think that would make me very miserable. Another thing that I really love about Sydney is that the people are generally quite friendly, and I know that some people say that it is hard to like make friends with people, and I do think there is some truth in that. I think a lot of the friendships that we make are based around high school, uni, and then work, so it's kind of hard to make friends outside of that. But I think on like a general day-to-day basis, when you go to a shop or a restaurant or anything like that, everyone is pretty friendly and nice. I think that is definitely a perk of Sydney, is that you can expect to be treated nicely. Obviously everything will vary and it's obviously dependent on what your personal experience is, but that is just my experience growing up in Sydney. Another thing that I love about Sydney is our free healthcare. Now this is not exclusive to Sydney, this is an Australian-wide thing, but I think that our Medicare benefits are unmatched, and we are so very lucky to have a government that prioritizes our health and doesn't privatize our health. Yes, you can get private health insurance, but you can see a doctor, and if they bulk bill, you don't have to pay for that doctor consult if you want to go to a GP. So that is really great, because it just means that people are willing to get their illnesses or diseases treated and won't wait until things get really complicated and bad before they see a medical professional. Obviously there are faults in the healthcare system. I personally am working as an occupational therapist in the healthcare system. I've worked in the hospital system in the past. There are issues with it, like there is issues with anything, but compared to, I know a lot of other countries like America, Australia has an amazing healthcare system, and I feel so lucky that we have that. We also have the NDIS, or the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which I'm currently working in that system at the moment, and that just gives people with disabilities access to therapy services and supports that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten. And I think that's an amazing initiative that Australia has done. Of course, again, there are a lot of issues within the NDIS, as I know very well working in it. However, it is so lucky that our people are, you know, protected in this country. The other thing about Sydney that links back to the diversity of Sydney is I love that we celebrate all different cultures. So we celebrate, you know, Lunar New Year or Chinese New Year, and we celebrate things like Eid and other festivals for every culture. I think it's great to see that everyone can come together. Even if you're not part of that culture, everyone is welcome to come and celebrate, and we love to share our cultures with each other, which I think is an amazing communal experience. And I think community and people and belonging is so important in our human existence. So I'm really glad that Sydney offers those fun festivities for everyone. The other thing I would say that's really good about Sydney is our education system. I guess this is all around Australia, but I think Sydney has really good schools and universities. I won't get too into it, but we do have great schools that people from around the world are dying to get into. I personally had an overall good experience through the education system. Of course, there were moments where I did not want to go to school or I didn't like it that much, but I think the opportunities that it did give me are invaluable, and I'm very grateful for that. Okay, this one is like a pro and a con. So the good thing about Sydney is that we do have public transport across all of Sydney, and Sydney is a really, really big city. There's no way you can see all parts of Sydney in a day or a couple of days even. I've lived here my whole life. There's still places that I've never been to before, but we do have trains, buses, and amazing public transport systems that can get you from one place to the other. Some parts of Sydney don't have as well of public transport systems as others, but I think in the grand scheme of things, they do try to make things as accessible as they possibly can. Well, that's what you would hope, right? But a con is that the parts that it is kind of hard sometimes to get on public transport, and I think there's things that could be better. Like for example, on the buses, they could have like those electronic screens on the buses like I saw in London, where you could see what stop you were getting off. Apparently they have that in Canberra, but they don't have it in Sydney, which is really strange. Canberra is the capital city of Australia, if you didn't know. It is not Sydney. But we are getting a new metro system in Sydney, which is really great. I think there's already a metro system in Melbourne. It just means that we get faster transport. And when I went to places like Hong Kong and Japan, those metro systems were amazing. The MTR in Hong Kong, amazing. I loved it. Even the London Tube was really, really great. So I think once Sydney has our metro, I think our public transport would be like really, really great. At the moment, it's still getting there. Okay, let's get to the cons of living in Sydney. One of the main things that I think is really, really hard about living in Sydney, and I think everyone would attest to this, is the cost of living. Sydney is the second most expensive city to live in, only second to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is exorbitantly expensive. I think everyone in Sydney feels the pressure. It is so hard to find a place to rent. You have like dozens of applicants. I know friends that have spent months looking for a place to rent. It is extremely hard to buy property. Property is so expensive, and it's pretty much almost impossible unless you have family support. I think my dreams of buying property is just a bit of a dream, really, like truly a dream, because I don't even know when I'd be able to afford such a thing. I think food and groceries and things, those have all gone up as well in these past couple of years after COVID. And because of inflation, the cost of living is getting really dire, and unfortunately wages aren't keeping up with that. So we are all definitely feeling the strain of the cost of living in Sydney. The other thing I think is kind of a con of Sydney is the traffic, especially the roads that we have. Because we started as a colony, there wasn't like a metro planning of roads, so it's not like Melbourne where their roads are very like straight and perpendicular. Our roads are very windy and they sometimes don't make a lot of sense. We have a lot of toll roads as well that are very expensive. There can be a lot of traffic, which makes commute to a lot of places really, really hard. So that can be definitely hard, and sometimes the roads, especially in the city, can be very tight and small, which can make them very difficult to drive through. But in saying that, the roads aren't as small as when I was in London, so maybe it's not that bad. Another thing that I find is a con of Sydney is that there is a lot of people. There is definitely a metropolitan vibe, and of course in any metro city the traffic is going to be busy, it's going to be a lot of people, but sometimes the hustle and bustle of that culture can be quite overwhelming. I think Sydney doesn't have as much of that culture as maybe some other big metropolitan cities like New York, but there's definitely that pressure of like, you know, grind, work, like you gotta do the best of the best, and sometimes you just want to break from that. But the good thing is that we do have lots of rural areas around Sydney that are pretty relatively easy to get to. They're 1, 2, 3 hours drive away, and you can kind of escape that city life, which I kind of like because sometimes I want to just be in nature away from all the people. But yeah, that can get a bit much sometimes. I think the busyness of everything can be a lot, and the crowdedness of everything. Another kind of bad thing about living in Sydney is that although the weather is pretty good, which is what I was mentioning earlier, and it's really warm, in summer it can get very, very hot, so you kind of have to use aircon all the time in summer unless you want to roast alive, which I used to not have housing with aircon in it, and it was torturous, let me tell you that. I only got aircon a couple of years ago. That also means that we are very prone to things like bushfires. A couple of years ago we had very, very bad bushfires that kind of went through all of Sydney. That can be very, very devastating. The bushfires is definitely something that we have to keep an eye out, and that also happens a lot in rural areas that get very hot. Thankfully we have an amazing fire brigade, and they, you know, do wonders for our community to keep us all safe. Another con about living in Sydney, I would say, is the distance from everything. And I guess this is just kind of overall about Australia in general, but it takes us so long to travel to other parts of the world. It's very expensive to get out of Australia, and even traveling interstate and flying to different cities in Australia. Like I flew to Perth and I think I spent $700 or $800, which could have gotten me a trip to Bali, which is outside of the country. When I went to Europe, I had to stop over in Hong Kong and then get to London, and that flight cost $2,000, and it took like 2 days to get there. So that's definitely a con of living in a very isolated part of the world, but sometimes I like our isolation. I like that we're kind of far away, so maybe that's a pro and a con. The other thing that I would say is kind of a con, and I think this is a con in any kind of multicultural city, is that there can be discrimination and racism where we live, and I think it has gotten better over the years. I think as I've grown older, there's been a lot more acceptance of different cultures, as I was talking about the diversity before, but definitely growing up when I was a kid, it wasn't as multicultural as it is today, and there was definitely a lot of racism, or like an undercurrent of racism that occurred and that I personally have experienced, but I think we're slowly getting better, fingers crossed. But I also think now, which is really strange, Sydney has a really high population of Asian people now, and it's kind of crazy because sometimes I'm like, oh, there's like Asian people everywhere. Whether we're born and raised here or whether they're international, there is a lot of Asians in Sydney, which kind of makes me feel at home, like I feel like I belong now, whereas before I never really felt like I belonged back in the day because there wasn't a lot of people that looked like me. It was very white dominated, but now I feel like Asians are on the rise. So yeah, very interesting take throughout the years. That is all of my thoughts about Sydney and the pros and the cons. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, whether you live in Sydney, what your thoughts are on the pros and cons. Do you agree with my list? Is there anything that I should add? What are the pros and cons of your city that you live in? If you live in another city, I would love to know, because I've again done my fair share of traveling, but it's a completely different experience when you actually live there. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Bye.